Yes, thank you, David. Warm welcome also to everyone, and particularly to our panelists and everyone joining in here. Great to see familiar faces and an amazing set of panelists. And David, thanks so much for opening and co-organizing. That's been a true joy. And really looking forward to discussing some of the key insights, looking back and forward on alliance research, a domain that is close to my heart. So once again, thanks for that, everyone, and looking forward to this session there.
Okay, so my suggested running order has been rather arbitrary. I've ordered our panelists in alphabetical order by the second letter of the first name, because I felt like alphabetical by first letter of part of the name is far too common. So the running order will have and I'm delighted to start off today's panel by inviting a assistant professor from the University of Toronto who does research on cooperative strategy in non-market settings. That's over to you, Kate Odziemkowska.
Thanks, David, and thank you so much for the introduction. So today I'm going to be talking about alliances to address grand challenges. And by grand challenges, I'm talking about sort of critical barriers that, if removed, are going to solve some important societal problem. Now, generally, this work acknowledges that because grand challenges are very complicated, they're going to require collective action and often sort of complementary resources coming from across different sectors. And in fact, we have 30 plus years of research on this phenomenon that emphasizes precisely that: complementarity in resources, trust building, and other things like that between firms, governments, especially service nonprofits as well, and thinking about how do you come together through collective action to solve grand challenges. So what I'm instead going to talk about, because we're talking about sort of newer developments in different areas of research of alliances, is the possibility that there's a symbiosis between conflict and cooperation. So let me start with sort of the theoretical foundations of where this might come from. So if we go all the way back to Ronald Coase's arguments on externalities, which are harmful effects on others, we know these are often a source of conflict between firms and sort of stakeholders, right? And Coase also pointed out that where there is harmful externality, the two parties can actually negotiate a mutually beneficial agreement in which either the firm compensates the stakeholder for the harm, or the stakeholder incentivizes the firm to discontinue the harmful activity. And so there you have this formation of an agreement in the hopes that conflict will be abated or avoided. In social movement theory, on the other hand, we have something called the radical flank effect, which posits that actors seek to reduce radical elements in their environment, and specifically they're thinking sort of radical movement organizations. And the idea behind this is you're going to support a moderate organization in order to do so. So conflict and cooperation here operate at a triad level, right? Where the firm is experiencing conflict from a radical stakeholder and answers that by forming a cooperative tie with the moderate stakeholder in the hopes that that conflict goes away. So these are sort of the theoretical foundations, but in practice, we're starting to understand that they actually work, right? So what we're increasingly seeing in the area of sort of grand challenges is contracts are being signed between firms and geographic communities called community benefits agreements in myriad industries, wind energy, universities, extractive industries. You can imagine all the different places. And what these do is define how parties are going to manage negative externalities, including environmental ones, but also social. They provide for offsets to those externalities in the form often of economic development, and they provide a governance structure to bring grievances and dispute resolution. On the radical flank effect, this sort of triadic sort of conflict cooperation symbiosis, we see a growth in collaborations between firms and moderate advocacy and protest organizations that also sort of aim to reduce negative externalities associated with firms' operations. So these have seen sort of exponential growth in their popularity, These are just two contexts that I happen to have data on. And in the case of collaborations with movement organizations, these actually now outnumber things like protests and boycotts and things that we often think that movement organizations do, at least as it pertains to the environmental movement in the United States. And a lot of this growth was in fact driven by conflict, right? So we have robust qualitative, quantitative, even formal models that shows that conflict can be a catalyst for collaboration. In the dyadic agreements that I talked about, right, these are formed in the anticipation of a future conflict from communities that experience externalities, have partial property rights, or are experienced in protesting. The collaborations with the movement organizations, on the other hand, are driven by existing conflict, which is sort of like protests and lawsuits, that endangers the reputational resources of these large sort of consumer-facing firms. And in terms of grand challenges, they can have profound impacts. So here I'm going to focus on the firm movement collaborations because we have a lot of more evidence on that. So things like coffee sleeves at Starbucks that basically removed the need for double cupping takeout coffee was a result of a collaboration with a movement organization. The plant bottle was a collaboration between the World Wildlife Fund and Coca-Cola. They also have operational, they also sort of introduce new operational benefits, right? So then I think the first hybrid and potentially the first EV delivery vehicles in the United States were a result of a collaboration between FedEx and the EDF. Coca-Cola's climate-friendly refrigeration, a collaboration with Greenpeace and Coca-Cola. They also have impacts on public policy. So sometimes the firms and movement organizations actually work collectively to advance public policy. And here, Greenpeace worked with Cargill to advance, to sort of pressure Brazil on an act to make sort of illegal deforestation for palm oil. Now you may be wondering, does that conflict that I mentioned before abate? And it does. So through these sort of dyadic agreements, both through the offsets or the sort of provisions they provide on externalities, as well as the dispute resolution procedures that are contained in them, you do see a lot less conflict. And it turns out shareholders like that, especially when the sort of threat of conflict is credible. There's actual credible sort of holdup risk. In the case of collaborations with movement organizations, we also see that they quell conflict, not just on the dyadic level, but from the whole movement, particularly through sort of relational ties and signals that they send to the movement around sort of the intentions and authenticity of those intentions on the part of the firm to actually address grand challenges. So let me conclude. I hope I've convinced you that conflict and collaboration can be a symbiosis. In terms of what I think is the next big opportunity in this space, is understanding what learning firms can get from these. Now, for most of you that study firm-firm alliances, learning is kind of an obvious outcome of alliances. Remember, the goals of these is not necessarily learning, it's about addressing grand challenges. So I think this is a huge opportunity for a number of reasons. We know there's a premium on human capital that has experience in advocacy and protest organizations, for example. We know that innovations that are supported by these organizations have more legitimacy with policymakers. We know these collaborations can lead to a mindset change in firms. A newly accepted SMJ just showed that firms acquire valuable local knowledge through community CSR programs. In my own work with IESE, we interviewed a bunch of R&D managers to understand the link between collaborations with movement organizations and innovation. And a lot of what we heard was that what you think are R&D departments that are highly, highly innovative, they actually pursue a lot of continuous innovation. This was talking to Bob Langard, who used to be the VP of Sustainability at McDonald's. And he said that working with the Environmental Defense Fund, which is an advocacy organization, unlocked a huge amount of innovation in their teams because they were willing to sort of go out on a limb. And we find that in novel patenting by firms in that study. So I see David coming on, so I'm going to stop there. I'm probably over my time. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Kate. Perfectly on time. We have roughly 10 minutes per presenter and then time for Q&A at the end. So one thing I'll say for our audience, if you have some questions that are coming up in the meantime, feel free to drop them in the chat, and then I will kind of moderate and may have a chance to ask questions in between presenters while they're switching over, or we might use those questions in the chat as the discussion starter later in the session. So for our next speaker, I am delighted to invite the Eleonora and George Landry Professor of Management at Cornell University, that is Gautam Ahuja. Gautam, let's get your slides up and running.
Are my slides visible now?
We see the PowerPoint interface at the moment.
Okay.
Okay, great. Thanks over to you.
I'll keep this. My focus now is just going to be to highlight a few areas where contemporary real-world changes are leading to very dramatic opportunities for alliance and other interfirm cooperative relationship research. And so I'll begin with this very simple illustration. We're all familiar with the physical value chain, which we've all used and taught in our classes. But the current sort of digital revolution has drawn attention to a slightly different version of it. And I call that the digital value chain. So consider a company like Lindt Chocolate. Okay, it's not, they do not have a global presence in operations, etc., but they do have a global presence, or a very large presence internationally in the product phase itself. But how do they then expand to the global sort of, setup and make sure that they are meeting the needs of a kind of a, customers in different geographies and so on and so forth. And if you go back and look at the back end of these, brands like this, now I don't know whether Lindt is actually using it or not. I'm not privy to their internal information, but I created a hypothetical illustration from the standpoint of a company selling a consumer product, which is very familiar. Okay, so it turns out that many of these companies actually, if you dissect their operations, have broken them up in many, many different ways. The front end is, let's say, a screen that shows up for a customer, and let's say that shows you Lindt chocolates, etc. The chocolates are made through a physical value chain. But then the entire process of the managerial process associated with these chocolates is entirely, or these products is entirely online in different, with different firms taking part in different ways. So because this chocolate is going to be sold directly, notice that many of these companies have historically sold through retailers and other agents, but now they are reaching out to customers directly. It turns out you need a whole infrastructure for those direct sales. And that is, in a sense, like one company that's very familiar for handling that kind of infrastructure is Shopify, which says you go and sell the chocolates and I will deal with everything, in the middle. But if you look deeper into Shopify's operations, you find that Shopify is a substitute for Amazon in terms of fulfillment and billing, but it's also complementary to Amazon and a partner to Amazon because it itself outsources some of its operations to Amazon. But that's not the only thing. What the customer is receiving is, let's say you get your packet of chocolates or something else, and whatever product you get, you're happy with it or not happy with it. If you're happy with it, we want to build a relationship with you. If you're not happy with it, we want to correct that. It turns out that entire customer relation management process is itself also driven by, could be through Shopify or directly through companies like Twilio or UiPath. And then connecting these various pieces could be a back office operator sitting somewhere in South Africa or something called UNS or EXL or Genpact or something. So what you saw in the value chain model was firms forming relationships for pieces of the value chain, but they tended to be things like R&D, etc. And then there was a core set of operations that firms did. Now, what seems to have happened is that firms are choosing some core areas to perform in, and the rest of the digital value chain is, or the rest of the value chain is actually being outsourced digitally in various ways. So what I've taken is a very simplified illustration of the at least 5 or 6 types of companies, because all of them differ. Twilio is both a competitor and a complementer and supplier to Shopify, and so on and so forth. Those 3 words could be used interchangeably for all of these companies. So how does this change the world of business, or what does it imply for our work on alliance research? So as we saw that it just took one slice of the customer engagement channel, we see the voice and video part is being handled by Twilio, the marketing analytics and customer service is being handled by WNS, and then the back end of the customer service, the computational and AI part, is being done by UiPath. Okay, so how is this different from physical value chains? First of all, notice that each of these companies, be it Shopify, be it WNS, or WNS less so, but be it Twilio, they're running extremely high fixed cost operations because technology is digital. It can be scaled up, but the flip side is that scaling up is very lumpy and hence fixed cost oriented. Once you're incurring fixed cost, you have a natural incentive to broaden your revenue base. So what that implies is that there are extremely high, since there are extremely high minimum efficient scale level at all levels in the vertical chain, each of these layers is itself becoming consolidated. And now you're having a very interesting interplay of value creation and value capture at work. The second part is, since it's technology driven, technology has an extremely short shelf life, and there is extremely high rates and speed of technological innovation, which means that these folks get incredibly specialized in what they do. So now the basic task, if you think about it from the standpoint of what would have been a simple chocolate company, is now facing these 2 sets of things. You're facing a backend which is almost entirely technological, highly concentrated and highly specialized, and now you need to manage this backend which has way more, extra firm, outside the firm kind of, collaborative requirements. Okay. And then there are some positives too. There is extreme flexibility. Connecting up with new firms may be as easy as adding an API, right? So you have that this thing. And the last part of this is the use of platform business models and the emergence of ecosystems as kind of a valid level of analysis and competition. And to see that, I'll just take a comparative, view of 2 of the same, more or less the same business, but run through a value chain versus a platform business model approach, and see how that again draws attention to all these opportunities in a different way. Some of you might remember a company called Webvan, which was home delivery of groceries. Okay, to the more current generation, you're more familiar with Instacart providing that service. But a comparison of the 2 business models actually reveals some very, very interesting sort of implications of moving from a physical value chain to a digital value chain. Okay, so as I put on the slide out there, the service is more or less the same, but if you look at draw your attention to the Instacart column here, and from there we can see that basically, in the old world, if you decompose that physical value chain, it had procurement, you had to buy a lot of trucks. Now it's all contractors. There are no trucks involved. The people bring their own vehicles to play. Okay, you had a large number of employee drivers. Those are now contractor shoppers. Again, shoppers and drivers, which is interesting. They have no benefits. They're paid per order. So you have that flexibility there. There's also some degree of regulatory arbitrage that comes into the picture because you're able to avoid, at least for now, minimum wage requirements, etc. Okay. Then you have, partnerships with grocery stores. So you never hold inventory. You have massive investments in tech, but they're highly scalable. And whereas in the old world, you had to have a lot of investments in heavy infra and startup costs. And of course, the most fun part of this is that in the old world, you were stuck with a 2 to 3% of grocery margins within which you had to make this whole value chain work. But now, if you decompose the revenue streams associated with a company like Instacart, you have at least 7 to 10 different sources of revenue, which are all potential partners in this game. So you have revenue from delivery fees, from subscriptions, from service fees, from peak pricing, but then you also have retailer commission for orders, white label solutions for retailers, advertising, because you now are in a position to, to shape the customer's preferences themselves and so on. And so we see that instantly the number of partnerships that you're required to conduct a business like this has gone on, has become very different. And what's more is it involves many more strategic dimensions than the earlier sort of solution that we had with respect to a vertically integrated model. So let me explore one of these avenues. I'm not going to go and then I'll stop right there. Okay, I'll skip these. So let's take one parent question of corporate strategy, which is which underlies a lot of alliance research. Should two businesses or sets of cash flows be combined? If so, what form should the combination take? Should it be a merger, a market, or a partnership? Okay. So it is internalization, market transaction, or an alliance interface. Now, under this, with that backdrop of that digital value chain in mind, notice how these questions are essentially coming in, and sort of it's giving us an opportunity to ask all these questions all over again in some respects in this new world. So the first one would be, under what conditions does technology change the transaction costs of internal organizing, including monitoring, coordination, incentives, and increase the scope of the firm? And its corollary, which is, when does it increase the costs of organizing, and thereby decrease the optimal scope of the firm? Corresponding question on the market transaction side is, under what conditions does technology reduce market transaction costs, etc.? And a mirror image of that question. And similarly, you could ask, does the changing scope of the firm influence the nature and rate and locus of technical change itself? Because now we have this new division of labor. And in turn, is that modifying industry structure itself? So there's a technology structure, there's a technology evolution question there, and a technology influencing industry structure question there. And then I'll end with this very sort of simply an illustrative, sort of a provocative observation, as I call it, or a conjecture. And that is the following. See, between 2000 and 2020, the horizontal scope of service-dominated businesses expanded considerably, as evidenced by the leaders in a variety of industries. If you look at all the businesses that Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, etc. are, while that of product-dominated businesses such as GE, GM, Kraft, HP has reduced. That suggests that these factors that I've talked about at Pick are actually interconnected with the nature of the product you sell. And obviously the firms in the top are largely dominated by the digital value chain. The ones at the bottom are largely, or at least have a very strong component to their physical value chain. Okay. But at the same time, the vertical scope of many of the horizontal scope expanders appears to have decreased. So now what they do inside, so even though Google, Microsoft, Amazon have expanded their number of product lines and distinct markets they compete in, what they're doing vertically also seems to have decreased at the same time. So Facebook itself is based, and Amazon are themselves, sort of in the back end, supported by several of the companies that I talked about, like Genpact, EXL, WNS, Shopify, Wix, Weebly, and all of these companies, right? So this has in turn sort of generated new forms of alliance management, such as governance, in terms of governance. For instance, you now have algorithmic management of alliances. And that's yet another arena in which, of which we know little. In other cases, because of the sheer extent of alliances, you need a form of governance to solve the problems of partner disputes. And you have to find a way outside the courts, because the courts are going to take forever for this kind of thing. So companies like Alibaba have set up their own system of courts now to deal with a dispute resolution, but many of these companies have similar sort of things in terms of dispute resolution, right? So what you're essentially seeing is this very strange sort of expansion of the breadth of the firm, and a simultaneously decrease and increase in the depth of the firm, which is the vertical scope of the firm. And all of these are things that we don't have much illumination on, So from the standpoint of being an alliance person, I think this is a great time. I'll stop here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Gautam.
Sure.
And if I was to try and sum it up in something that I, from a conversation I was having with a coffee shop operations manager, it sounded like pretty much every business now is a technology firm. Every business is integrating technology into its operations. So let's move forward. We've delighted to hear from the Joaquim Molins Figueras Chair of Strategic Alliances at IESE Business School. Over to you, Africa Ariño.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining, and thank you for the invitation to be on this panel. In a nutshell, I'm going to first talk about alliance process research as a key development of our understanding of alliances, and then I will move to talk about stakeholder governance mechanisms in the context of alliances as an area that deserves additional attention, which connects actually pretty much with what Kate was talking about and somehow to what Gautam talked as well. So let's put ourselves back into the early 1990s, at the time when the strategy field was dominated by transaction cost economics. And actually, the resource-based view was just making its first inroads. The focus of alliance research at the time was on the choice of organizational form, and under what conditions a particular organizational form is more efficient than another. And this implies that there was a focus on the initial conditions and the structure of alliances. There was, for quite some time, a debate on whether it's structural conditions or the management processes that drive alliance performance. But however, it's both the structure and process, because the value that an alliance ends up creating, it's the potential value, which is driven essentially by the efficiency of the organizational form that's put together. And to that, you need to subtract the collaboration costs. So the initial potential value, the assessment is based on whether an alliance value is greater than 0 and greater than any other alternative organizational form. And the collaboration costs are an estimation, but they depend at the end of the day on alliance management processes. So I love this quote by Joe Bauer and co-author of his: if you want to achieve a certain outcome, manage the processes that lead to the outcome. So we actually need to understand alliance processes. So the early research started with this 1994 AMR piece by Peter Ring and Andy Van de Ven, where they explained the processes of how alliances and more broadly interorganizational relationships, which again speaks pretty much to what Gautam was talking about, how they emerge, evolve, and dissolve over time. And they make the point that these processes are cyclical, not sequential, and that alliances and IRs remain alive because not because they have achieved stability, but a balance between formal and informal processes. Then the piece by Yves Vos in SMJ 98 asked a very provocative question: what drives that evolution? Is it initial conditions or learning processes? Remember, at the time where everything was focused on efficiency. And he finds that its initial conditions may lead to fixed processes or that make an alliance inertial, or to evolutionary processes that make it very adaptive. And that depends on whether the initial conditions allow for cognitive learning or also for behavioral learning. This is a new understanding of initial conditions that moves us from static efficiency to dynamic learning. And then in my article with Jose de la Torre, we integrated these two frameworks and expanded them, providing more detail about behavioral learning processes and how this may lead to a positive spiral or to a negative one that eventually leads to the dissolution of an alliance. But we needed more research on how the initial conditions are actually created. What are the processes that lead to certain initial conditions? So there is some later research that focused on this, on the creation processes, that conceptualize them as a learning platform that give partners an opportunity to learn during negotiations, and that shapes the expectations that each other have about future behavior, and in turn that leads to certain negotiation outcomes, which are the initial conditions. Also important here is the literature on learning to contract, the work by Kai Myers and Chris Argyris on how you need to learn to address contingencies as they appear, and that means that this gets into the contracts, and contractual dictate increases with time. But another sign of learning during negotiations is that if, to the extent that you have negotiated in the past, it's easier for you to reach a mutually acceptable agreement, and that manifests in a shorter negotiation time. And lastly, I wanted to mention the work by Pinar Oskan and Kathy Eisenhardt on the creation of alliance portfolios, which nowadays most likely they would call ecosystems. And that's a very interesting piece on how to create these ecosystems in emerging industries where there are no previous connections, and partners probably come from very different industries. So let's move to the area that I think deserves more research attention, which is alliance stakeholder governance mechanisms. And by this, I mean organizational level mechanisms that design the participatory rights and responsibilities assigned to the multiple stakeholders of an organization. And a broad research question from which many can stem is what are effective alliance stakeholder mechanisms? And why is this important? Back to Kate's presentation, we face many grand challenges that at the societal level that we do not know how to solve, and that requires partnerships among the different stakeholders. Now, these partnerships are created around projects that we could say are new to the world, things that we have never done before. And they involve many types of stakeholders. So they involve the stakeholders that contribute resources that allow for value creation, but they are very diverse. It could be they are companies, they are public entities, they are at times non-governmental organizations, and so on and so forth. And of course, they have different goals and values. And it's very easily they have not collaborated in the past. So, but also there are other stakeholders that need to be brought into the decision-making processes and into the governance. So those are the intended beneficiaries, the individuals or communities that for whom the service or products, or actually more than service or product, are being created, whose needs need to be served. And also affected communities that are impacted by positive or negative externalities that cannot be easily anticipated from the beginning, because these are new to the world project. Now, the effective governance of these types of partnerships requires, again, involving various stakeholders, but at different stages. So we need to take a dynamic approach here. When it is moving from the design to the implementation to the management stage. So at the design stage, the central question is, what does joint value mean for the stakeholders involved? And it's unclear what the needs that need to be covered are. Also, reaching consensus is difficult because of the very diverse stakeholders involved, and the resources needed are even unknown. So at this point, not only contributing, but also beneficiaries of intended beneficiaries of the project should be involved to make sure that the project actually addresses the needs of those beneficiaries, which may not be well defined. At the implementation stage, actually, it involves articulating the process that realizes the value envisioned at the design stage. And at this point, chances are that there is already clarity about which parties must be involved and what their utility functions are, as well as the specific contributions required. So the challenge here is that of coordination, of synchronizing the resource contributions and activities of the various parties. And the main stakeholders to be involved in governance are the contributing ones. And lastly, at the management stage, the central question is how can the created value be sustained and distributed in a way that meets the objectives of the partnership and serves the broader societal needs. And here there is a need to engage the broader ecosystem of stakeholders. There is a need to co-opt some stakeholders, but at the same time being careful that those that have privileged positions do not co-opt weaker stakeholders who are pressured to collaborate while leaving aside those who resist. So here, all stakeholders need to be involved. And this is why I think that it's which are effective stakeholder governance mechanisms to address these challenges is what needs to be researched to be able to address the governance challenges, cooperation, coordination, and co-optation. And I leave it here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Africa. And our next speaker is an associate professor at Temple University and has published research on alliances and and their role in knowledge production. Over to you, Vivek Tandon.
Thank you, David. Thank you all for coming in today, Monday, just after many of our semesters have ended. So what's interesting is even though we didn't coordinate, a few of my thoughts kind of are at a niche of what Gautam was talking about. But I'll try to keep it more forward-looking, and few of my thoughts about where we can go with alliance research are quite ambitious. So let's see. So just to think about where we have been. So when I was in my PhD program, at that time, it was around 2008 or so, the alliance research was already quite well established at that time. And it was really a large literature, and I had to make some sense of it. And the way I organized it in my head was with levels, like dyadic approach, looking at dyads, then network approach, looking at an entire interrelationships network, and as a portfolio approach, like a firm having a portfolio of alliances. To me, I was really intrigued by the portfolio aspect of it because it sounded more strategic to me. Dyadic seemed much more tactical, that you are solving a specific problem, and network approach seemed not totally influenced by the firm's activities. So that is what led me, that is why portfolio level attracted me. And and since then, portfolio research, alliance portfolio research has developed quite a bit, and research has looked at how different features of portfolio affect performance. And in a way, it can complement alliance management capability research, because you cannot think of portfolio as a goal-oriented strategy without a centralized governance capability or a management capability. In this regard, I thought that while the advantages of portfolios and how different features lead to advantages are more studied, the cost of portfolios was less understood. And that is where I concentrated quite a bit of my research, like competition among partners. So when we are thinking about portfolios, we are thinking about relationships between partners. And even more broadly, alliance portfolios itself as a component of a broader knowledge production portfolio. So I was thinking about how competition among partners affects the stability of portfolios and even future R&D capabilities and so on. But going forward, so in the last few years, as I've been talking to practitioners and listening to a lot of podcasts, business podcasts, two broad themes keep recurring again and again. And both of them have come into very sharp relief in this in the last 1 year or so, or maybe in the last few months. So the first is this issue about geopolitics, international geopolitics. So when we are thinking, like Gautam's presentation also, even though he was not focusing on that, a lot of these portfolios or ecosystems that these companies are building are international in nature. They are spread across the globe and across different kind of countries, like rich countries, emerging economy countries, and so on. Even small firms who are starting in the tech space today have development offices in India and in some cases in many other countries. So when we are thinking about alliance portfolios, then we are also thinking about international portfolios. So, and this geopolitics is becoming increasingly more important, even in first Trump administration, then Biden administration, and Trump too. This is becoming more and more relevant for business. And this is what, when I talk to business people, this is what they are thinking about most at this point. So how does it affect our research on alliance portfolios? So I am only raising questions right now. I don't have answers, but I would love, and these are not easy questions to answer, but I would love answers to these questions. So when we think about alliance portfolios across a vast geographic spread, we are thinking about coordination costs and even redundancy costs. Like, do we source the same material or same resources from alliances across different countries? And are these good? And whether or not they are good is also in comparison to what other options are there, maybe greenfield or acquisitions across different countries. So what are the trade-offs involved is a very fascinating question. And how does the portfolio itself changes when the geopolitical tensions change? So I was listening to an interview from a textile manufacturer who said that with the new tariffs, they cannot suddenly change their sourcing alliances because they basically make silk. Hello? Am I?
We still hear you. Vivek. Yeah.
Okay. So she was telling that most of her products are silk garments, but there is only one country in the world that has the artisans who can work silk, and which is China. But with the new tariffs, it is becoming extremely difficult for her to keep those sourcing and still make money. So one of the solutions they were thinking about was creating marketing alliances within China itself so that they develop Chinese market. So instead of, so are we going to see different constellations, like different trade groups with different sets of alliance constellations for each firm? I don't know, but that's an interesting question, I think, to think about. And the second important thing is the digital transformation that Gautam was talking about, and AI is just one part of it. But what is very unique about AI is that the data becomes much more critical and premium, and there is a premium on owning and transforming it. And that is because the insights that come from data analytics or using AI are most useful when they are using it for predictive purposes and using their own proprietary data to do it. Because and in healthcare and banking, data security becomes important. So using data from outside sources or sharing your data with general purpose models don't do the trick. So you have to build your own models with your own data. So data becomes the critical resource for new value creation. Similarly, there are compatibility issues. Data is stored in different ways and different sets of data across different divisions or different firms. So when you are collaborating with firms, how much are you willing to share this data? How much are you willing to transform the data becomes a very critical question. On the other hand, at the same time, value creation opportunities also increase due to tech convergence. So even tire manufacturers, for example, are thinking of putting chips in their tires so that they can manage the fleet. They can inform the trucks fleets of when to change the tires and so on. I was recently talking to a person who was making fire suppressants, and they collect enormous amount of data. So their customers are basically mines and where the equipments are very prone to catching fire. And they gather a lot of data from their various installations around the world. And they are running engines to predict which of these machines may catch fire and suppress it. That is a new business that they are trying to develop. But the bigger problem is, do their vendors allow them to use this data and combine this data and so on? So the interesting questions here is that with this AI and digital transformation, do these factors limit data sharing? And if they limit data sharing, what is the impact on alliances? Or maybe they foster cooperation. So this fire suppressant guy will have much better collaboration with the mining folks. From a portfolio research point of view, how does the composition of alliances themselves change? Are we going to see more marketing alliances where the outcomes of data analytics are shared rather than data itself? Are we going to more vertical or more horizontal alliances? Maybe horizontal alliances are more difficult to do in this setting because the data sharing becomes more of a problem. But vertical alliances, you could, because again, you could only use the outcome. Are we going to see more long-term relationships? Because any kind of data sharing or data analytics will involve transforming the data and therefore more relation specificity, or maybe more short-term relationships. That is because of tech convergence, who are your collaborators can become competitors very fast when new technologies come up. So are we going to see wide but shallow portfolios or narrow but deep portfolios? So I don't have answers to these questions. I have some speculations, extremely difficult to do, but I think it is very exciting to explore this, just like Gautam had talked about earlier. That's all I have right now. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Vivek. Okay, and so our fifth panelist today is a professor of strategy and John H. Lauron Chair of International Management at INSEAD. Over to you, Andrew Shipilov. And Andrew, you're just on mute at the second.
Yep. Hello, everyone, and good to see you. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we do. Yeah.
Okay, very good. So we haven't coordinated, but the topics of alliances and ecosystems seems to come up in the presentations of the previous speakers, and it probably indicates that this is an interesting topic to study. And when I teach alliances, ecosystems to the executive education participants at INSEAD, I typically fight against this imagery, where an executive goes on stage and they put a slide with their company logo in the center and a whole bunch of logos around and say something along the lines that the company's success is built on partnership ecosystems. Because this particular approach just tells the ecosystems are important. It does not separate partnerships from ecosystems. And we as researchers can dig deeper to understand what is the difference between alliances and ecosystems, and what kind of research questions could we address and explore by separating the two. Typically, when I think about the difference between alliances, partnerships, and ecosystems, I think of partnerships and alliances as synonyms, and then one could view them as a formal collaboration between firms that presupposes some shared risks and control. That also implies that not all relationships with external stakeholders are strategic alliances and partnerships. And to me, when I think about the difference, when you talk about buyer-supplier relationships, these are the relationships that exchange money and goods and services through the pipe between the firms. But that's not what we're really interested in strategy nor theory. We're interested in more enduring relationships. We're interested in the ones where firms actually learn and they get something more from these relationships over and above the exchange of money and goods. It has to be some kind of a formal contract that governs what Michael Yakabidis with colleagues would call non-generic complementarities. Essentially, when we think about the difference between an ecosystem and an alliance, in both of them, in ecosystems and in alliances, the link that connects the firms has some non-generic complementarities. These are the complementarities that require coordination between participants. The difference between ecosystems and the alliance is that there's nothing on top of a non-generic complementarity between the firms that helps them regulate the exchange. You basically have two firms connected with non-generic complementarity, and that's an alliance. Now, that's an ecosystem. But for the alliance, what has to happen is on top of this non-generic complementarity, there is a formal contract that governs between firms, that governs the relationship between firms, that presupposes the shared risk and control. So if we have established the difference between alliances and ecosystems, again, an ecosystem is a group of firms connected with non-generic complementarities. Alliances, groups of firms where on top of a non-generic complementarity we have a contract, then we could imagine that firms could exist in both alliances and ecosystems at the same time. So this is an example that Annabelle Gower and I have in our 2020 Academy of Management Annals chapter, where we show that when we look at Apple, for example, or any company for that matter, it would be embedded simultaneously in ecosystems and alliances. The dashed line here on this slide is a non-generic complementarity. The thick line on this slide is an alliance. And on the left-hand side, you would see an alliance between Apple, AUN, Allianz, and Cisco. On the right-hand side, you would see the participation of Dropbox, Adobe, or Microsoft and other developers of apps in an Apple's ecosystem. But Dropbox, Adobe, Microsoft, or other developers of apps, they are not Apple's alliance partners. They just remain a part of Apple's ecosystem. And then what we probably don't care very much in our research journeys is the relationship that Office Depot would have with Apple, because in this case, that relationship is simply buyer-supplier tie, and we just put it there because maybe Office Depot could supply paper and pencils and other office equipment to Apple, but that would not necessarily be of interest to researchers because that's simply a buyer-supplier tie. Now, we've established the difference between alliances and ecosystems. We have shown that alliances and ecosystems could basically embed the firm in different contexts. Then what could we do with that knowledge? Well, for example, with Annabel Gower, we have tried to apply network theory to study inter-organizational ecosystems, just like we applied network theory to study inter-organizational alliances, except, of course, the difference is that when you look at the inter-organizational alliances, your circles are the firms and your lines are alliances. When we think about ecosystems, the circles can also be the firms, but the lines could be non-generic complementarities. And the matrix, if you put all the firms in an ecosystems in a typical socio matrix and code whether or not these firms are embedded with a non-generic complementarity between each other, just like in the past we would have looked at are these firms embedded with alliances between each other, all of a sudden we have the network of interdependence matrices or matrices consisting of non-generic complementarities that would allow us to apply graph theory and network methods to think about systematically about what do those technological interdependency means. And we have a paper with Natalie Burford, Nathan Furr, and myself in a strategic management journal, which came out in 2022, where we'll look at what could happen if we operationalized ecosystem positions as a function of firms' embeddedness in the webs of non-generic complementarities, but that clearly these are simply baby steps in that direction of structurally thinking about ecosystems, and there's more to be done. For example, we could think about more about how network theory could be used to operationalize non-generic complementarities in an ecosystem. We can think about what do graph theory or network constructs like clustering or centrality, what could that mean when applied to non-generic complementarities in ecosystems? And what's even more interesting but very difficult to study is to how firms internally organize to manage ecosystems. We know a little bit from the work of Dovev Levy and colleagues how firms organize internally to manage alliance portfolios. We know less how do they organize themselves to manage ecosystems. So far, I don't know really systematic work in that space. One place I could suggest to look is a case study at INSEAD that Yves Dose and Bart Derova have written in 2021. And that case study looks at how Lego set up its internal organizational structure to manage its embeddedness in an ecosystem. And this is an image from this case study. This is basically Lego as it embedded the whole bunch of non-generic complementarities with firms like Apple, Google, Netflix, Amazon, Disney, and what are the different elements that they need to juggle in their mind as executives of Lego to manage this whole complexity. And then the whole case really centers around, okay, if Lego lives in this very complex world of ecosystems, how should it set up its operating structure internally? And what they eventually ended up doing is creating this multi-layer of different initiatives where, for example, individual relationships with Google or parts of Google ecosystem would be managed by somebody which is called a flight captain, which is sort of a business unit person who would be in charge of that tie. Then the relationships at the organizational level would be coordinated by somebody they called, or by the mechanism they called control tower, which is essentially a group of people who achieve coordination between the flight captains. And if there are issues in terms of resource access or the problems at the very, very senior level of the organizations that could be resolved only through the engagement of senior leaders, they had to have set up something which is called Partnership Forum, which is a group of senior LEGO executives who literally able on a very short notice pick up the phone and talk to their senior counterparts in Amazon, senior counterparts in Google, senior counterparts in Apple. So I really like this case study because it shows the problem, how the company like LEGO could manage its relationships in a very complex ecosystem, gives one answer, but I think us and academics could dig more and understand what maybe other answers there are to help companies manage their embeddedness in different alliances and ecosystems. And also maybe if they systematically think about as researchers, how do we build structure into systematically thinking about interdependencies at the ecosystem level? So on that, that's it. Thank you very much.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Andrew. So I am delighted to now sort of open to some Q&A and reactions, especially any reactions by our panelists to each other's presentations. I'll start with one observation, which is mainly aimed at any doctoral students in the audience. But I found it notable that all 5 of our panelists mentioned the conversations they've had with executives and how that those conversations have influenced the way they're thinking about cooperative strategies. And I think that this is certainly a phenomenon where research on it is something that executives care a lot about and can have a lot of impact on practice. I could kind of just start with a question for Gautam, really. This transition from traditional value chains to digital value chains is super interesting, and it makes me wonder if what impact it has on alliance capabilities. Do you think that firms who've developed strong capabilities to manage alliances in traditional value chains can transfer those to digital value chains, or is it something totally different that might be a sort of a competency destroying type of a transition?
Sure, David. I think that's a great question, and my take is we've got hopefully a lot of doctoral students out there who are paying attention, because it's a great question to ask formally, especially if you compare, my presentation with what we just saw with Andrew's presentation, where I thought he did a very nice job of separating these, these 2 kinds of relationships. And my take is, based on his presentation, the answer to your question is that they could have a variety of, influences, and we have to figure out under what condition it becomes positive, negative, or irrelevant. And so I think that's part of the story. But first of all, we have to, and I think Andrew's point makes a lot of sense, is, when is something purely an alliance versus an ecosystem partnership? And that question itself needs to be addressed in some fashion. I thought he's provided a very nice, thoughtful approach for that, and so I think that would be a part of it. But I also want to say, because I may not have the chance to say this again, I found this, I don't know about the audience, but I found this incredibly informative. Each one of the presentations that was, Africa, Vivek, Kate, Andrew, has given me a lot of food for thought. So thank you for putting this together. Yeah.
Definitely, it's our pleasure to host this panel. Also, I'll check in with Koen. Do you have any questions or remarks?
Yes. Thank you so much, David, and thank you all panelists here for some wonderful, looking back and looking forward here and sharing, your insights on what are, I think, some of the key areas to look at in alliance research. I mean, one of the questions that pops up in my mind is kind of, I think it's interesting that the field has kind of moved from, alliances, networks more toward ecosystems, as some of you have reiterated. And, I think Kate also was talking about, right, the public and private partnerships that, is also kind of, related field in that. And I'm wondering, kind of what, and this is maybe a somewhat more generic question, maybe than the one also that David was pointing towards here. You know, what do we think that with that transition, you know, what kind of aspects of prior work are relevant for some of the new domains that you're pointing towards? And which areas are really kind of, you know, new and open and key areas to still, you know, unravel that prior work in alliances has not really, you know, is incapable of addressing in some of the open domains that you look to. So in other words, you know, what can we borrow and, you know, use from prior work and alliances in some of the new fields that you would that you point to, and which are really kind of, you know, new and big open areas that we, you know very little about, given all the work that's already been done. You know, anyone, you know, obviously, you know, feel free to pick this up.
Yeah, maybe I can jump in here. I think that also across the various presentations, we have talked a lot about governance. And I think that specifically governance mechanisms are something that we need to dig deeper into, as opposed to governance structures, right? But for instance, Kate talked about which governance structures that we need to this collaboration, to achieve collaboration in alliances for grand challenges. So I think that it's also what are the governance mechanisms, and in this particular case also it speaks to stakeholder governance mechanisms. Or Gautam talked about governance for the algorithmic management of alliances, and I think this is a great area. Andrew talked about also the rules of the ecosystem. At the end of the day, this is about governance. And I didn't take note on what Vivek mentioned, but definitely in the context of artificial intelligence, there is a lot of room for governance mechanisms. And again, I insist in mechanisms.
Thank you so much, Africa, for your question. I think we also have a question here from our participants. So please, you know, feel free to join in with questions by raising your hand and or, you know, typing your question in the chat box so we can pick it up. Can I say Tunji, am I pronouncing your name correctly here?
Yes, perfectly. Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yes, please.
Okay.
Please go ahead with your question.
Yeah, so it's I found Andrew's distinction of the ecosystems and the alliances really interesting, and it links with what Kate said about partnerships for grand challenges in a very interesting way that I think is related to what's happening now with global tariffs. So I've been doing some work with governments in Nigeria and South Africa who are trying to get big tech players to source in Africa, right, to drive growth. But these players to create, to have alliances with tech suppliers in these African countries want ecosystems, right? They want there to be many players, a healthy ecosystem of tech suppliers, so that competing, for example, US companies can partner with different suppliers in the ecosystem. And it's also part of why, as we know, ecosystems like the Chinese tech suppliers are really sticky because there are multiple interlocking players across multiple nations in the sub-region that make it really difficult to source from anywhere else. So I find it interesting that you have partnerships, alliances trying to solve these grand challenges of building, growing employment in Africa. And these alliances are trying to get Western companies to come and source, to come and, you know, they're trying to create a market for alliances for tech companies, but the tech companies want ecosystems, so there are multiple players to partner with. And I just find it really interesting. Partnerships, government for grand challenges, alliances for tech companies, and the tech companies requiring ecosystems so that they have multiple people to source with. So I really enjoyed it, and I think it's really interesting the way they seem to link together. Thank you, Jess.
Great.
Thank you, Tunji.
Thanks for the comment.
No, but I think it's a really good point. I would actually see Grand challenges is a specific area where ecosystems and alliances could be super useful. Sort of if we had this kind of giant Venn diagram, there would be like alliances, ecosystems, and grand challenges would be one important element. And I think the challenge for all of us is to think about how do we develop, on the one hand, the generalizable arguments that would apply across different contexts, but also specific enough to get to the gist of the mechanisms which we can test within a particular context. And I think what's really interesting about focusing on grand challenges was sort of draw the boundary condition in which we study this, and then we can isolate the mechanisms that would maybe help us better understand what is happening when we think about ecosystems and alliances at the general level. But it's actually feels really, really good to be on the cutting edge when I teach this kind of thing, because executives are struggling with this as well, right? So in their heads, there is a mess. In terms of alliances, ecosystems, platforms, they all need help to help disentangle these things. And if we can do that for them, that would be super helpful. And then it gives them language to decide and discuss amongst themselves what these things mean. And then they could implement these ideas either within the grand challenges domain or in broader domains. So I think really here as business schools and business educators, we can really make a difference by helping them think through all these really multi-layered problems, because alliances, ecosystems, partnerships, private-public partnerships, these are important things. They're really used to solve important problems. Executives are trying to solve the problems, and we can provide them at least some language, some concepts, so that they communicate amongst each other to get stuff done.
Wonderful.
Great, thank you, Andrew.
Well, I think that is a wonderful note to end on. So I just want to say thanks again to all of our panelists. Thanks to the audience for joining. The folks in the STR division in the background who helped make a lot of this stuff happen. So Paolo on communications and Deepak, the division chair. I'll just make a very quick shout out. If the topic of the role of data in business models and maybe the cooperative strategies around data is of interest, we have another virtual panel coming up on May 20th, an STR conversation asking, does technological convergence lead to scholarly convergence with strategy and information systems? Thanks to all, and have a wonderful week ahead.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
David.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.